Imagine waking up one winter morning to learn that, while you were asleep, a nuclear bomb had almost erased an entire American state from the map, and no one told the public for decades. On a cold night in January 1961, over the quiet farmland outside Goldsboro, North Carolina, a B-52 Stratofortress bomber sliced through the dark sky, its wings heavy with two Mark 39 hydrogen bombs, each one more powerful than all the explosives dropped in World War II combined. The mission was routine, part of the tense nuclear patrols of the Cold War, but high above the fields and pine forests, a simple mechanical failure turned routine into catastrophe. As the plane began to leak fuel, the crew fought desperately to stabilize it, but moments later the aircraft tore apart in midair, fire and metal scattering through the night, and the two nuclear bombs fell toward the sleeping countryside below. One bomb drifted down slowly under a parachute, glowing faintly in the searchlights of rescue crews, embedding itself gently into a muddy field. The second bomb did not fall so kindly. It slammed into the earth at nearly 200 miles per hour, breaking apart on impact, scattering components deep beneath the soil. But what made that night truly terrifying was not just the crash itself, it was what happened inside those bombs as they fell. Each hydrogen bomb contained multiple safety switches designed to prevent detonation under any accidental circumstance. As investigators arrived, they discovered something chilling. 3 of the 4 safeguards on one of the bombs had already failed in midair. The bomb had armed itself, as if it believed it had been deliberately dropped in war. Only a single tiny low-voltage trigger, a final sliver of safety, had stopped a thermonuclear explosion that could have vaporized miles of farmland, poisoned the soil and rivers, and altered American history forever. Imagine the blast cloud towering over the Carolinas, shock waves rolling across small towns, the radioactive wind drifting toward the East Coast, reaching cities like Washington, D.C. and beyond. Engineers later calculated that if the bomb had detonated, the destruction zone would have stretched for dozens of miles, turning the quiet farmlands into a wasteland. The local residents had no idea how. Have you ever heard of the night when an ordinary maintenance error almost erased an entire American city from the map? In September of 1980, deep in the quiet farmland outside Damascus, Arkansas, a routine check inside a Titan II missile complex turned into one of the most terrifying near disasters in U.S. history. A story so unbelievable that even today, many Americans have never heard how close the country came to catastrophe. It began with something shockingly small, a simple dropped wrench socket. Inside the underground launch complex, airmen worked beside a massive intercontinental ballistic missile standing over 100 feet tall, its sleek white frame containing a single thermonuclear warhead over 500 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The missile sat hidden beneath a steel silo door, part of America's Cold War nuclear shield, silent and waiting. The crew was trained, disciplined, and careful, but even the best trained people can make one tiny mistake. During a pressure check, a young airman loosened a bolt high on the missile's fuel tank. The heavy socket slipped from his tool, bounced once, and disappeared into the narrow gap beside the missile. Seconds later, it slammed into the thin metal skin of the fuel tank, piercing it like a knife through paper. At first, there was only silence, then a faint chemical hiss as deadly liquid fuel began spraying into the silo. The crew instantly knew what that meant. The Titan II used hypergolic propellants, chemicals that ignite explosively the moment they touch each other, and they were now leaking uncontrollably inside a confined space. Alarms blared, commanders rushed to evacuate the site, while specialized teams were called in to contain the leak. Above ground, police and firefighters began clearing nearby homes, unsure whether the missile might explode or the warhead might detonate. The strange, choking smell of fuel drifted across the fields as residents watched flashing lights cut through the darkness, unaware that
the march that should not have existed. The orders were never meant to be read aloud. They were written quietly, by candlelight, in cramped quarters where breath fogged the air and ink threatened to freeze before the pen could move. Once delivered, many were burned immediately. Others were memorized, then destroyed. If the plan failed, it would never officially exist. Because what George Washington was about to authorize went against every rule of 18th century warfare and common sense itself. A window measured in days. By early February 1780, scouts reported subtle but alarming changes along the Hudson. The ice still held, but not everywhere and not forever. Cracks formed near the center channel where the current ran strongest. Snow melted during the day and refroze at night, creating deceptive layers that hid weakness beneath a crust of white. Washington understood the brutal math. Wait too long and the river would swallow men and equipment. Move too soon and exhausted soldiers might collapse before contact with the enemy. There was only a narrow window, measured not in weeks but in days. So Washington chose speed. The mission no one wanted. A selected force was ordered to move rapidly across the frozen river and strike British outposts along the eastern approaches. The goal was not conquest, but disruption. Confuse the enemy, capture supplies, force Britain to question every assumption. The men chosen were veterans, those who had survived Valley Forge, hunger, and disease. Even they hesitated when they heard the plan. Cross the Hudson, in winter, at night. One officer wrote later, "We knew the river could kill us without firing a shot." Yet no one refused. Preparing to walk on death. Preparation was minimal. There was little time. Soldiers lightened their loads. Heavy tents were left behind. Only essential ammunition and rations were carried. Cannon were abandoned. Surprise mattered more than firepower. Footwear was the greatest challenge. Many men wrapped their feet in extra cloth or animal hide. Some coated their boots with grease or pitch to repel moisture. Others had nothing to improve at all. Frostbite was not a possibility. It was an expectation. Night on the ice. The crossing began after sunset. There were no drums, no commands shouted. Even coughing was suppressed. The ice responded to their presence with low, hollow sounds, groans that echoed across the frozen expanse. Every few minutes the column halted while scouts tested the surface ahead. Rifle barrels were cold enough to burn bare skin. At one point, a loud crack split the night. Men froze in place, hearts pounding louder than any musket. But the ice held. Barely. When the ice took a man. Halfway across, disaster struck. A soldier near the rear stepped onto what appeared.
Before the sun rose on December 26, 1776, the future of the United States was hanging by a thread, and most of the world had already written the American Rebellion off as a failed experiment. The Continental Army was cold, starving, unpaid, and collapsing from desertion, while the most powerful empire on earth waited confidently on the other side of a frozen river. What happened in the next 24 hours would change history forever. By the winter of 1776, George Washington was not the heroic legend we imagine today. He was a desperate commander leading fewer than 2,400 exhausted men. Just months earlier, the Declaration of Independence had been signed with bold words about liberty. But the reality was brutal. British forces had crushed American troops in New York, pushed them across New Jersey, and driven them into Pennsylvania. Many soldiers' enlistments were about to expire on January 1st, and morale was at rock bottom. Some men left bloody footprints in the snow because they had no shoes. Even members of Congress believed the revolution might be lost. Across the icy Delaware River in the town of Trenton stood about 1,500 Hessian soldiers, German mercenaries hired by Britain. They were experienced fighters and confident after repeated victories. The weather was terrible, freezing rain, snow, and violent winds. No rational commander would attempt an attack under such conditions. That is exactly why Washington decided to do it. On Christmas night, 1776, Washington ordered his army to cross the Delaware River in darkness. Huge chunks of ice floated in the freezing water. Soldiers struggled to move cannons across on wooden boats, some slipping into the river and nearly freezing to death. The crossing took hours longer than planned, and by the time the army reached the New Jersey side, it was already early morning. According to the original plan, the attack should have been canceled, but Washington made a decision that defined his legacy. He pressed forward. The American troops marched 9 miles through a blinding snowstorm.
When the ice let go. The thaw did not arrive like spring. It came like collapse. One day, the Hudson still bore the scars of winter, white, cracked, and groaning under its own weight. The next, dark seams opened across its surface. Water welled up through fissures like blood from old wounds. Ice plates shifted, collided, and shattered with a force that echoed for miles. The river was not gently returning, it was reclaiming. The first break. Witnesses along the banks described the same moment. A deep rolling sound, low at first, then rising, followed by a violent surge. Entire sections of ice broke free, lifting and grinding against one another. Trees trapped in the frozen mass were ripped out by the roots. Anything caught between moving ice and shore was crushed without mercy. People ran. Those who had grown used to walking across the river suddenly realized the ground beneath them was alive again. Several did not make it back to shore. Supply lines destroyed. The frozen Hudson had temporarily simplified logistics. Wagons crossed directly. Shortcuts existed where none had before. The thaw erased all of it. Ice jams formed suddenly, damming water and then releasing it in floods. Roads washed out, bridges weakened or collapsed. Storehouses built close to the river were torn open by surging ice. For both armies, the damage was severe. But for the British, dependent on rigid supply schedules, it was catastrophic. Starvation after survival. The cruel irony of the winter was this. Many who survived the cold now faced hunger. Crops had failed the previous autumn. Livestock losses were enormous. Mills damaged by ice could not grind grain. In rural areas, families boiled leather scraps. In towns, bread riots threatened. People traded heirlooms for flour. Winter had not ended, it had changed form. Disease in the melt. As ice retreated, filth emerged. Frozen waste, long buried under snow, thawed all at once. Contaminated water spread illness rapidly. Dysentery and fever swept through camps and cities alike. Men weakened by cold succumbed easily. Doctors were powerless. What the frost had spared, disease claimed. The prison ships after ice. When the ice finally cleared New York Harbor, British prison ships were revealed in full. What they contained shocked even hardened sailors. Bodies lay stacked. Survivors were skeletal, bare.
What the winter taught America. The war did not pause to reflect on what had happened, but the men who survived the winter of 1780 did. They carried its lessons in scarred hands, stiff joints, and memories that returned every time the wind cut too sharply or the cold lingered too long. The winter had not been a single event. It had been a brutal instructor, and America learned. A new kind of warfare. Before 1780, much of the Continental Army still tried to fight like Europeans. Formal lines, seasonal campaigns, predictable movement. The frozen Hudson destroyed those assumptions. Washington now understood something the British never fully grasped. Flexibility was power. After the winter, the Army emphasized smaller, mobile units, rapid marches, surprise over spectacle, survival as strategy. Winter was no longer a pause in war. It was a weapon if you knew how to endure it. Officers forged in ice. Many of the officers who would later shape the United States proved themselves not in great victories, but in keeping men alive during the winter. They learned how to shelter troops quickly, how to ration without breaking morale, how to read land, wind, and weather. These skills mattered as much as tactics. The Army became less elegant, but far more dangerous. Washington's hard authority. The winter hardened Washington himself. He became more decisive, less tolerant of hesitation, more willing to dismiss officers who could not adapt. Critics still existed, but fewer dared to challenge him openly. He had stared down nature and kept an army intact. That earned something no vote could give: trust. Civilian memory becomes myth. Among civilians, the winter transformed into legend almost immediately. Stories grew taller with retelling, rivers freezing in an instant, wolves howling at city edges, children surviving nights wrapped in nothing but blankets. Not every detail was accurate, but the core truth was. In the winter of 1780, the people of the young United States woke up to a world that seemed to have slipped out of reality itself. Because the cold that arrived was not just another harsh season, it was a phenomenon so extreme that it reshaped daily life, warfare, and history in ways that still sound unbelievable today. This was the winter when New York Harbor froze solid, when ice roads formed across rivers, and when the Hudson River became strong enough to support wagons, horses, and crowds of people as if it were land. At the time, America was still fighting for its independence, resources were scarce, and survival was already difficult. But nature delivered a challenge that no army could prepare for. The cold began suddenly in January. Temperatures plunged far below anything recorded before or since in much of the eastern United States. Thermometers of the era struggled to measure it accurately, but written accounts describe breath freezing in midair, ink turning solid inside pens, and food freezing indoors near fireplaces. Snowstorms piled layer upon layer across cities and countryside alike, burying roads and isolating communities. In New York City, the East River and the Hudson River froze so deeply that people walked from Manhattan to Staten Island and New Jersey. Markets were set up on the ice, with fires burning on the frozen surface, something almost impossible to imagine today. This winter struck at a critical moment during the American Revolutionary War. George Washington's Continental Army was already suffering from lack of supplies, inadequate clothing, and hunger. Soldiers wrapped rags around their feet because shoes had worn away. Many froze to death on night watch. Yet the cold also changed military possibilities. British ships, usually protected by water, were trapped in ice. Movement by river, once a strategic advantage. The winter that refused to stay in the past. The winter of 1780 ended, but it never truly left. It lingered in memory, in warning, and in comparison, resurfacing every time America faced cold, hunger, or the threat of collapse. Long after those who endured it were gone, the winter remained a quiet reference point, invoked whenever survival itself seemed uncertain. History carried it forward. Worse than 80. Throughout the 19th century, Americans compared harsh winters to one standard: the winter of 80. Farmers used it when crops failed. Town elders invoked it when urging preparation. Parents frightened children into caution with it. If a winter was bad, it was nearly as bad as 80. If it was catastrophic, it was worse than 80. No other season earned that distinction. The Civil War echo. 80 years later, during the American Civil War, letters from soldiers mentioned 1780 with surprising frequency. Union troops enduring the winter of 1863-64 in places like Virginia and Tennessee referenced stories passed down by grandfathers. One soldier wrote home, "They say even this cold is not like that of the Revolution, when rivers froze solid and men walked upon them." The comparison was not accidental. It was reassurance. If the nation had survived that winter once, it could survive again. Military doctrine remembers. The U.S. Army did not forget either. By the mid-19th century, winter logistics, cold weather shelter, and seasonal adaptability were more deeply embedded in American military planning than in many European counterparts. The lesson of 1780 was institutionalized. Never assume the season will save you. Never assume the enemy will stop. The frontier and the old fear. As Americans moved west, the memory of catastrophic winter traveled with them. Pioneers heading toward the Midwest and Great Plains carried stories of frozen rivers and starvation. When the winters of the 1930s and why the sky turned against the earth. For centuries, the winter of 1780 was explained with one word: misfortune. People believed it was God's will, bad luck, or a once-in-a-lifetime accident of nature. No one could imagine that the cold had a cause, one that could be studied, traced, and partially understood. But science has a long memory, and slowly it began to uncover the truth behind the frozen world. A winter beyond normal patterns. Modern climatologists agree on one thing. The winter of 1780 did not fit normal North American weather behavior. Cold waves usually come and go. 1780 stayed. It arrived suddenly, deepened unnaturally, and lingered with brutal consistency. Rivers froze that rarely froze. Temperatures remained extreme for weeks rather than days. This suggested something larger was at work, something global. The volcanic clue. In the late 20th century, scientists studying ice cores, long cylinders drilled from glaciers, noticed something strange. Layers corresponding to the late 1770s contained unusually high levels of volcanic ash and sulfur compounds. Volcanoes, when they erupt violently, inject massive amounts of sulfur dioxide into the upper atmosphere. This creates aerosols that reflect sunlight back into space. Less sunlight means lower temperatures. The Earth cools. The 1779 eruption hypothesis. While no single eruption has been definitively identified as the cause, evidence suggests one or more significant volcanic events occurred in the late 1770s, possibly in Iceland or the tropics. These eruptions would have dimmed sunlight across the northern hemisphere, altered atmospheric circulation, strengthened cold air masses over North America. By 1780, the effects converged. The result? An extreme winter amplified beyond normal limits. The jet stream locked in place. Another factor appears in modern reconstructions, a stalled jet stream. Normally, the jet stream when the past knocked on the present. Modern America likes to believe it has outgrown winters like 1780. Central heating hums behind walls. Satellites track storms days in advance. Highways are plowed. Power lines stretch across continents. The frozen world of the 18th century feels distant, almost unreal. And yet, the past has a way of returning, not as memory, as experience. The illusion of safety. Every generation believes disaster belongs to history, until it doesn't. In recent decades, Americans have watched power grids fail under extreme cold, cities shut down by ice storms, supply chains fracture overnight, millions lose heat, water, and safety. These events are not identical to 1780, but the feeling is sudden vulnerability, uncertainty, the realization that systems can fail. Echoes in modern winters. When Texas froze in 2021, journalists reached for history. When the Northeast faces record-breaking cold, historians are interviewed. And inevitably, someone mentions the winter of 1780, not as trivia, but as context, because it proves the cold can still surprise us. Infrastructure versus endurance. In 1780, survival depended on people. In the modern world, survival depends on systems. That is both strength and weakness. When systems fail, people must rediscover the old skills, sharing resources, adapting quickly, checking on neighbors. The winter of 1780 did not teach Americans how to build heaters. It taught them how to endure failure. The frozen Hudson as metaphor. The Hudson River freezing solid was not just a physical event. The winter that could have erased a nation. History often tells us that nations are born in moments of glory. Declarations signed, battles won, flags raised. But America, in truth, was nearly erased in silence, under ice, hunger, and a sky that refused to warm. The winter of 1780 did not announce itself as destiny. It arrived as suffering. When nothing was guaranteed. There was no certainty that spring would come in time, no certainty that the Army would survive, no certainty that civilians would endure, no certainty that the idea of independence was worth the cost. What existed instead was persistence. Men rose each morning not because they believed in victory, but because stopping meant death. Families shared what little they had because isolation meant extinction. Leadership meant not inspiring speeches, but staying present in the cold. The Hudson remembered. Long after it thawed, the Hudson River remained frozen in memory. It stood as proof that the natural order can reverse without warning, that defenses can vanish, that obstacles can become paths, that stability is often an illusion. For one winter, water became land, and history followed. The real miracle. The miracle of 1780 was not that the river froze. It was that people did not give up. An army without shoes survived.